Hey y'all, it's Alinka, and I'm so excited for you to watch this interview. As you probably know, we've been doing Speaking in Thumbs book club on TikTok. It's a book all about how to correctly interpret texts, what texts say about someone's personality, how to catch lies over text, and so much more. I got to sit down with the author of this book, Dr. Mimi Winsberg, to hear a little bit more about how to correctly interpret texts when you're dating someone. And it goes all the way from dating apps to when you're in a long-term committed relationship. I loved this book for a lot of reasons, but one of them being you can implement the tactics and the teachings that she shares almost immediately. I hope you find this interview valuable and let me know what you think. Enjoy. Hi, Mimi, and thank you for being here today. Before we dive into your book, Speaking in Thumbs, could you give everyone a quick background on yourself, how you got into studying texting and eventually writing your book?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm a psychiatrist by training, and I've been working in digital mental health for some time now. And one of the things we do in digital mental health, of course, is deliver sessions over tele tools like Zoom, but we also use text messages to look for signal. So if someone's texting with their therapist, can you tell if they're depressed or even suicidal? And so we look for these kinds of signals, which of course got me thinking. I've also served as the on-site psychiatrist at Facebook and treating the employees there. And even the most tech savvy people in the world are at times really befuddled by their own text messages. So it's a confusing subject, and I thought I'd shed some light on it with Speaking in Thumbs.
This book talks about how to interpret text basically from any stage of a relationship, from the talking phase, as we call it now, to when you're in a long-term relationship. Me and probably a lot of people listening are Gen Z millennial. We grew up on texting. We think we have an understanding of it, but why is it important to understand how social cues essentially come through over text?
Yeah, it's a relatively novel language. We started texting in 2007, and now it's become the predominant way that we communicate, particularly in our love lives, right? And so what I argue is that our brains haven't fully caught up to this mode of communication, which is great and convenient, but it lacks certain cues like facial expression, tone of voice, and other things that we use in person. And so what I wanted to do is give people a guide and see if I could explain what we can learn from text and maybe take some of the anxiety out of the process.
Something that you touch on in the book is the Big Five personality test and how text patterns can essentially reveal where a person scores on that test. Can you give us a background on what the Big Five measures?
Yeah, the Big Five measures five important dimensions of personality that tend to be stable over a person's lifetime. So there are lots of personality tests out there, but the Big Five tends to be more reliable and more stable. And what it measures, first off, is openness. The way to think about it is the acronym OCEAN. So openness, people high in openness tend to be more curious and more imaginative. And they might be a little bit more artistic and appreciate diverse views and experiences. Whereas those lower on openness are a little bit more traditional and don't like novelty or change as much. Conscientiousness, people who are high in conscientiousness are organized and do what they say they're going to do. And they tend to be high achievers, whereas people who are less conscientious tend to kind of go on their own time and might not necessarily be as reliable. Extroverts like people and are outgoing and get energy from other people, whereas introverts tend to like more quiet time alone. And then people who are agreeable tend to have a lot of compassion and respect for other people. And, they will tend to go with the flow, whereas less agreeable people will be, more independent. And then neuroticism is an axis that measures maybe how high strung a person is versus how relaxed they are.
Can we walk through what someone's texts essentially reveal about each of those five traits at a high level?
Yeah, people who are open tend to use language that's more expansive. So you'll see words like human, universe, art, and always. And their punctuation will be expansive too. So you might see that 3-dot ellipses, fewer periods, fewer constraints. Conscientious people are a little bit more descriptive in their language, and they'll use words like completed and boring. They'll use the word adventure too, even though they might not be the most adventurous of the group. They tend to use periods and colons versus commas in their punctuation. And people who aren't as conscientious will use what we call cognitive discrepancies, a lot of coulda, shoulda, woulda, and they'll use future tense like I will, I'm gonna, versus now doing it. Extroverted people will use lots of smiley face emojis, thumbs up emojis, winky faces emojis, and they use language like, well, words like mouth, other, restaurant, drinks, not surprisingly, because they like to go out. And then agreeable people will focus on the you. So you'll see lots of you and your pronouns, and they use words like wonderful, together, and they pepper their language with heart emojis in all of their forms. Neurotics tend to use some of the more dramatic emojis in the emoji library, and some of those really loudly crying faces, or the one that looks like the screen, and they'll use words like awful, lazy, depression in their language. So those are the things to look out for in the big five.
In the book, you talk about something called thin slicing, which I hope I defined this correctly, is essentially the ability to extrapolate accurate information from a small data set. In this case, you can look at a few texts and see as a psychiatrist where someone scores on the big five personality test. How long do you think it would take the average person to be able to interpret that same information?
So you described thin slicing very accurately. The important thing about thin slicing is it's a learned skill. So one of the keys to thin slicing is having lots and lots of experience or training doing it. Like a professional basketball player can see things on the court that somebody who doesn't really know the game won't be able to see. So I kind of joke that I'm a text whisperer because I've spent a lot of time looking at what texts mean. And what I hope to do is teach it to other people so they could have that kind of knowledge as well.
Throughout the book, you have a lot of examples, and the way that you extrapolate them are so quick. And I feel like I got better at it throughout reading and more accurate. Like I would try to guess what you were going to explain about the person prior to reading your blurb. So I can see how it's a learned skill for sure.
Yeah.
In the early stages of dating, how analytical do you recommend someone be? And how do you kind of balance this false sense of like, I'm getting to know them, but I haven't actually spent, quality in-person time together?
I think you have to balance in-person time with texting, but what I guess the point I make is that it's a useful data set, particularly early on. When we first meet somebody, we pay attention to lots of things: how they look, how they dress, how they treat the wait staff. And I would say that this is an important thing to pay attention to along with all that stuff, in that it's a pretty rich source of information.
Mm-hmm. Is it a red flag to be nonstop texting someone early on?
I don't know so much of a red flag, but I think it can set up unrealistic expectations if you haven't established an in-person chemistry. So it's a little awkward if you've texted that much and then you meet the person and don't feel attracted to them or don't like the way they smell. So I would say balance it with in-person chemistry, but it isn't necessarily a bad sign if you've got great text chemistry to begin with.
That makes sense. Are there any major red flags that you recommend people look out for in the early stages of texting?
Sure. Well, I give people tools on how to recognize lies. I think nobody wants to be with a liar. And then over-promising, or something I also call instamacy in the book. So too much, too soon, that can indicate poor boundaries. That can be a red flag. I think if somebody's controlling initially, that's really a bad sign. That's only going to get worse. And then I tell people to watch out for a particular kind of humor that is humor that puts you down. Negging maybe is an expression, but we don't want to be with somebody who's going to be putting us down.
Yeah, that's a great thing to look out for. I think it's easy to overlook early on because you're like, oh, that was funny. But then it just starts to become like, wait, this is always about me. On the flip side, are there any green flags, or can you spot green flags via text?
Yeah, I mean, what you were talking about, that sense of chemistry over text, so great banter, a shared sense of humor, that the person seems to get you and you get them easily. Communication's not difficult. You have that feeling that you've known the person a long time. It's easy. So those are all green flags. It's chemistry over text.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it kind of, I think, flows from in person to text, and hopefully vice versa too, from text to in person. If you're getting along,
Yes.
you'll get along in person as well. So kind of moving beyond the talking stage or the kind of early on texting, you're getting to know people, you're getting to know someone. Something that you outline in the book is what you call communication styles, or the 5 languages of texting, which help us get to know someone better and build intimacy. Can you explain what each communication style is?
Yeah, I borrowed from Gary Chapman's love languages because I think there are love languages over text too. And I outlined 5 love languages. The first is compliments, so kind of mimics the words of affirmation. And the second one is riffing, and that's the kind of funny banter that we were just talking about, that where you're making time for the other person, you're setting aside other things just to text with them about nothing in particular. The third love language that I talk about is spoon feeding, and that's when you are giving somebody up to the minute updates about everything that's going on in your life. Here's what I'm eating for lunch, so on. Some people like this, some people don't. Nudging is another love language over text, where you're reminding somebody or encouraging them or giving them emotional support through the day. And then the last one that I describe is nooking, which can be anything from sweet nothings over text to full on sexting.
So what happens when you and your partner, the person that you're texting, have different communication styles? I mean, is it doomed? Can people compromise? Can people change their communication style?
Yeah, I think that this is tricky because we can modify, of course. And one of the things we do when we really like somebody is we mirror them. That's an unconscious tendency that we do, is that we start acting like the people we like and do mirror them. But I don't think people change that much. And some of the things that you encounter, differences in preferences or differences in communication styles, some of those are going to be there to stay, and you have to decide whether you can live with them.
It's less about changing your style and just understanding this is a part of how that person communicates. Can I work with that?
Yeah, John Gottman, who's a famous couples relationship expert, says that I think 73% of the issues in any relationship are unresolvable and irreconcilable. So you've got to learn to live with them. So pick somebody where those aren't a deal breaker.
Yeah, I think that's why people say compromise, right? Is key. So now that we've covered the early stages of dating, we've talked about growing closer. I think the next era in any relationship is eventually having a conflict over text. It's probably, I would say, inevitable these days, especially as the whole book talks about texting as a major form of communication. How can a couple create a safe environment over text to allow for conflict resolution?
Great question. I think the first thing is to set norms around it and to know when to take it in person. So there probably are some conversations that you shouldn't have over text. But I give people good practices to adhere to and then ones to avoid. And the good practices are not surprising. There are things like curiosity, ask questions, patience, take your time, understanding, seek to understand the other person, and then acceptance, accept the other person for who they are. The bad practices are ones that John Gottman has outlined in many of his books, but they are things like criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. So those are bad practices of communication that we should avoid in person and over text.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like anything that essentially shuts down or negates how you're feeling is a red flag, which corresponds to how people argue in person as well. As
That's
you
right.
mentioned.
I think empathy and respect are good practices to sort of adhere to across the board.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about gender differences. How do men and women interpret text differently from early stages into a relationship all the way to being in a long-term relationship?
Yeah, this is so interesting. And of course, we generalize when we start talking about gender differences. But in general, men like short texts and they have trouble handling long ones or multiple questions at once. So when you're texting a guy, keep it short. And then women if they're receiving compliments, they like to receive metaphorical compliments. So they'd rather hear something that has a metaphor in it than just "you're hot." Um, if there's lots of texting going on in a relationship, in general, women feel like that's a great sign. We're texting all the time, things are going great. Whereas men tend to think, oof, if there's lots of texting going on, maybe things aren't going so great. We need to communicate a lot. So there's a bias for women to like more texting and men to like less texting.
It's funny because I feel like that kind of talks about like men are from Mars, women are from Venus type of communication styles. Like it's completely different. I don't know if you've ever seen on any of the memes on the internet of like a guy getting a paragraph of a text and guys are like, no one's going to read this. And women are like, why? Like, you can read the text. But it is research backed that they just don't, unfortunately.
As I say in the book, once you exceed, I think it's 365 characters, it's the equivalent of a face tattoo. It scares them away.
This book is largely focused on romantic relationships, but are these tips that you give, can they expand past this and kind of go into friendship and how people maybe Slack message or text at work, et cetera?
Yes, is the short answer. They can, but I think the tips are a little different at work, and that's a project I'm working on now. Is work communication, because of course over Slack, so much of our communication is happening asynchronously, and we're using emojis at work all the time now. It's interesting to think about how you message your boss differently than how you message a peer, and how emojis are used at work versus in social relationships. So I think stay tuned for more on that.
I'm really excited about that because I work in marketing, and the way that different people message, I'm like, it's so different than how I would, explain a thought. So I'm already excited for that next project.
I'll give you one little tidbit on that, which is that the slightly smiling face emoji, the one that's not a full smile, but a slightly smiling face, that's in general meant to be positive, but a lot of Americans use that to mean I'm exasperated right now, and we're not getting to a resolution at work. And so I think the way that gets used for exasperation versus positive emotion is interesting to look at, and interesting to look at cross-culturally. So in Asia, particularly in Japan and in Korea, doesn't mean exasperation. In the US, much more likely to mean that.
That is interesting. This is kind of segueing from what is in the book, but do you see those, I guess, country by country or differences in personal texting as well?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because Speaking in Thumbs is going to be translated into Japanese, Chinese, and Russian. And I think it will be interesting to see the reaction and what differences do really exist cross-culturally. They are there, I'm sure.
Well, congratulations on that. Both of those projects. That's awesome. Is someone's age a factor in interpreting their texts? And what I really mean here is when I text my parents, for example, I just think they have a different style overall, where if my friends texted me how my dad did with like a bunch of periods at the end of every sentence, I'd be like, you're mad at me. But I know that he's not, because that's just how, and then this is making a sweeping generalization, but
that's exactly
older
what
people text.
That was my answer when you first started, is your dad will put periods at the end of a sentence. He's not being rude.
Yeah. So there are just generational differences.
There are generational differences, absolutely. And norms get established every 6 months, right? New things become new, and language is rapidly evolving. It's very alive as a phenomenon. And so we need to grow with it. And interestingly, we learn more as we go through life, but I think with language, we have to turn to the young people to sort of set the standards.
Do you think someone can actually be a bad texter?
Well, there's certain instances where, sure, like if it's your second language, or maybe if writing's a challenge. I think also with attention issues, sometimes people with attention issues forget to hit the send button, and that can be challenging, right, if you're the recipient. So yeah, I think some people might have challenges, language or attention or otherwise, but too many people use it as an excuse, right? I'm a bad texter, so I'm not going to communicate.
I would agree that it's used as an excuse. Is there any research on having read receipts on or off, what that says about maybe your big five? And then the same with text reactions, how you can heart and emphasize, for example, iMessages?
Yeah. So I haven't seen any research on it. My personal view on the red receipts is that conscientious people do favor that
Mhm.
versus lack of conscientiousness. But I haven't seen any research on it, and I think it's an interesting area. I think the text reactions also are interesting. I think when they first came out, everybody was really dismissive of them, and now we use them all the time, and they're great. So I think we'll see more on that.
Yeah, I love them and I would be eager to see that research. I also think that there is debate on like, is it a response if you just send an emoji or not emoji, a reaction? People are kind of torn on that.
It's used a lot in banter, but it's also used to end the conversation too.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely use it for both. So that makes sense. Can you share some high level tips on interpreting a lie over text? How could someone quickly spot that maybe someone's message isn't true?
Yeah, I go into this in the book. I give people tips to spot lying. It's a really hard thing to do, but here are some guidelines is that people who are lying are trying to keep an emotional distance from what they're saying. So they'll tend to drop the first person pronoun. They won't use I in the sentence. They'll drop that because they're emotionally distancing from the statement. The second thing is they'll either give a lack of detail or way too much detail and repeating the detail in a kind of an annoying way. They'll dodge the question, or they'll use phrases like to be honest or other things that are emphasizing that they're telling the truth in language.
Mm-hmm. I think what's interesting is similar to some of the other red flags that you mentioned earlier. Like there's almost a gut check component where you're like, is this person making me feel maybe a little crazy or um, invalidated by just, like you said, blatantly ignoring? And of course, those red flags, they come up
Right.
over text
Right.
too.
You got to trust your gut ultimately. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are feelings obviously that come through when you talk to someone. Thank you so much for giving your insight on this book. Like I said, I absolutely love it. I think it's so interesting, and you can immediately apply all the learnings into your life as well, which I think is really cool. If people want to find you and stay updated on your work, where can they go do that?
So you can find me on my website, which is drwinsberg.com, drwinsberg.com. I'm on Twitter at mwinsberg, and I'm on Instagram as Text Whisperer.
Awesome. Thank you.